Great, thank you. I'm Kathleen Ash-Milby, for those of you who don't know me already. And I just want to, before I go into this, I want to introduce the two other panelists here. For those of you who don't know G. Peter Jemison, can you wave your hand? The three people there who don't know who he is. Peter is a member of the Seneca Nation. He was the founding director of the American Indian Community House Gallery in New York City and formerly served on the board of directors of the American Association of Museums. He continues to represent the Seneca Nation of Indians on repatriation issues and served on the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. He is currently the site manager of Ganagadan State Historic Site in Victor, New York. Sitting next to him is Alan Michelson. Alan is a Mohawk artist who has exhibited internationally, including at the Moscow Biennale, the National Gallery of Canada, the Biennale of Sydney, the Museum of Art and Design, and the National Museum of the American Indian. His work is in the permanent collections of the National Gallery of Canada, Smithsonian, and the Art Institute of Chicago as well. I also want to just say a word that Jolene is very sorry that she can't be here tonight. She's got possibly the flu, so she felt like it was unwise for her to travel. When we were talking about this program, I guess it was about 9 months ago, we were talking about creating some programs that really gave a look at the original exhibition, We the People, and talked about the Native art community at that time. And thinking about that, we put together a list of names, and these included Kay and Jolene, really looking to bring artists who were in that original exhibition forward to talk about their experiences then and reflect on changes in the Native art community and the Native art world and mainstream acceptance of Native art over the last 30 years. So before we get into that sort of nitty-gritty, I wanted to frame We the People and talk about some other things that were going on in New York City about the same time. So Harry, can you do the next slide? So in a lot of the material I've been reading in preparation for this talk and the brochure that was created for the exhibition upstairs and just generally discussion of We the People, it's often compared and contrasted with a precursor exhibition, which is translated as We Are Always Turning Around on Purpose, which was an exhibition in 1986 in Westbury, Connecticut that Jean Fisher and Jimmy Durham also worked on. But the other exhibition that happened about the same time that doesn't get mentioned is an exhibition called Women of Sweetgrass, Cedar, and Sage. And that was in 1985. And as I was looking at this exhibition and kind of thinking about what the impetus was for this show, there were a lot of parallels. The Community House exhibition started with a conversation between Jean Quick-to-See Smith and Harmony Hammond. And it was really, they're talking about this need to get Native women artists in particular visibility in New York. And there was a similar impetus behind We the People, and in a similar way there was a liaison or a champion from the mainstream art world, and in which case it was Jean Fisher, who was working with an indigenous artist and trying to find a way to make that visibility happen. I think that with We the People, it's stated pretty clearly in the material that was written about it and in Jean's own words that they really were trying to open the door for these artists to the mainstream. Even to the extent that Edgar Heeperbird's pulled out of the show, there was some disagreement about some of the content of some of the work in the exhibition and not wanting it to be too local. He was interested in having a show that was focused very much on Oklahoma and Indian Territory issues, and they felt that that was too distant from what the art world in New York was going to be interested in, and sort of resisted that. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if that explains the difference between the reception of the two shows, but I did want to bring up this exhibition that Jean curated because, and this is a picture that was passed to me by a couple of different hands. I believe it belongs to Lillian Pitt, who was in the exhibition. The exhibition included, make sure if I get these numbers right, actually 30 Native women artists, mixed media, multimedia exhibition, and a large group of them were there for the opening. So this picture was taken, I believe, outside on the street of the gallery.
Right.
Jolene's here, Jean is up here, the Spider-Woman Theater ladies are here. I can see Shelley Nero and Gail Tremblay, a lot of really important people to the field of Native art. And something I think that was also really important at this time, and it didn't start in the 80s, it actually started in the 70s, was that Native artists were driving these exhibitions. That this is a time when they weren't getting reception in mainstream institutions. It was very difficult to get into galleries. And Native artists were taking it into their own hands and saying, okay, we can't get the shows. We're going to do our own shows.
Right.
So Peter, who was the founder of the gallery at the American Indian Community House in 1978, was around when a lot of this foundation was being laid for these important critical exhibitions that started to happen in the 1980s. And I wondered, Peter, if you could talk a little bit about maybe just a sort of glancing look back at the 70s that sort of led to the formation of the Community House Gallery in 1978.
Right. Now it's kind of Gagweko. I give thanks that all of you are well. And this photo, I'm going to start from this because this was really, I want to say, an unqualified success in the sense that we got really good media coverage for this particular exhibition. The work of these artists that were involved was, very high quality. It was just a really well put together idea and, with a great title. Women of Sweetgrass, Cedar, and Sage, looking at what are the sacred items that people use in their communities. So, yeah, and there are some people here who played some very important roles. So I'm going to start out in the last row, and this is Vera, Colorado, Charlene Touchette, who, by the way, was working with Jamaki Highwater when he put together the book on the 53 artists. And then the person whose face we can hardly see is Lillian Pitt. And I'm going to call upon Donna or Joe to tell me the woman in the sunglasses. Do you remember her name?
Is that Shelley Nero?
Marlene?
No, Marta Carlson.
Marta
okay.
Carlson, right. She's imitating Shelley Nero.
Yeah, it's a lot like her.
Okay, and then it's Gail Tremblay, and then it's Muriel. And then there's Aaron, who was with Atlatl next to Jean. And I don't remember Muriel's friend in the back. Gretchen? Okay. And then, as I said, Jean, then Harmony Hammond, and then Kay Miller is the far right. And then if we go across the front, of course, it's Gloria. This is Dorothea Romero, Donna Couteau, who was here with us tonight, an actress, and then, of course, Jolene. And I'm not quite sure who's just peeking in there. I think that's, what you call it?
Lisa Mayo. Oh, no.
No, I don't think so. Lisa Mayo was there. I skipped over her. Lisa Mayo was the one crouching down and looking forward. Anyway, combination of actresses and artists and photographers were all gathered, and writers and organizers, so forth, were together. So again, this was kind of 1985. By this point in time, the gallery was over on Broadway. We had an entrance also on Mercer Street, about 842 Broadway. Previously, the gallery was at 386 West Broadway. So I'm going to go over a little bit of history. For some of you, this is a repetition because I talked a bit about this when we launched the book here. But Lloyd Oxendine was very instrumental in beginning the movement to have contemporary Native artists shown within the art world context. Lloyd Oxendine created a gallery which he opened at 133 Wooster in Manhattan, in Soho. And I think we've talked about the date of that. It had to be sometime after around 1972. He may have started some work on it in 71, but it was pretty much running through 72. And I would say my memory of it is it goes maybe right up to about 76 or late 75 that the gallery is a viable place. And I worked with Lloyd, and we curated exhibitions. And again, as Kathleen said, we kind of took the bull by the horns and we said, we'll have to do it ourselves, because it's clear that no one else is going to initiate this. And the only two that did do that worked at NMAI. Well, before it was NMAI, it was the Museum of the American Indian at 155th Street and Broadway. And the people working there was Mr. Dockstader, who was the director, and then two of my friends were curators there, Tom Martin and Susan Krause. And they pulled together an exhibition that included Fritz Scholder, it included Neil Parsons, it included myself and George Morrison, and you know, and it was really a non-event. You know, at 155th Street, so few people went there, and yet there was this amazing collection there. So, you know, from that situation, Lloyd said, I'm going to start a gallery. And he asked me if I would join with him, and, you know, that was sort of the beginning of it, and we began to, you know, create that gallery and create that scene in Soho. And he had great success. I mean, the one thing is the 1972 article in Art in America, which was already marked here, and the other thing was an interview on the Today Show with Barbara Walters, in which he showed very many images. Another was the show at the Brooklyn Museum's Community Gallery. It was a very well done show as well. And so, you know, there were some definite successes that came as a result of that. And always, I think the effort was, you know, we have artists who are out living, maybe they're as far away as Alaska, maybe they're as far away as California or Oklahoma or South Dakota. And the only way that they will become known, if at all, is if we have a space here where we can show their work and work in a kind of a community or as a place to introduce other artists. This work here, want me to talk about it? Okay. The upper left image is one by Jolene Rickard, and that's roughly probably 1982, I would say. A powwow dancer by the name of Kyle Dowdy. This drawing right here, just one example of Will Guy, who here is sitting here. Will, would you raise your hand, please? This is Will Guy. This is one of his drawings. Will has created his own alphabet, and from that alphabet he creates poems, and then when they're the colored version, they're really stunning pieces. And I'm a huge fan of Will's work. He's very modest about it. And the centerpiece is Edgar Heap Birds, and this is one that was shown in the gallery on West Broadway in about 1984, the first time. I think this is a remaking of it, but in the original it was shown on West Broadway. And the one person who was really taken by this piece was, and she'll come back to me in a minute, okay, Jean Quick to See Smith on the far right. Famous actress who developed Parkinson's disease, and everybody knows her.
Annette Funicello?
Katharine Hepburn. Oh. Katharine Hepburn came into the gallery while I was running it, and I heard her voice, and then I walked out into the gallery to try and answer questions. I could not get words out of my mouth. It was Katharine Hepburn. And to finish that quick story, she stayed for a while. She asked questions about this piece and about some of the other work. She, with two companions, young people, went down the stairs because it was a second floor location, went across West Broadway through all the traffic that was going back and forth, jumped into the driver's seat and pulled away in a kind of a beat-up old car. It was like Katharine. We had a balcony, so I was able to run out there and watch the kids wave to me as she pulled away. Anyway, so that's these four pieces here.
Can you talk a little bit about the community of artists at that time when you did start the gallery at the Community House in '78? Like, what drove you to do that after Lloyd's gallery had closed?
Well, you know, I had gone back home. I went back home to Cattaraugus Reservation, which is my home community. It's about 35 miles to the south of Buffalo, New York. And I started working for the Seneca Nation, and I was creating an education program and doing the cultural component of having those people who possessed our traditional knowledge pass those on in a kind of a classroom setting, which was a very strange idea for our people, but it was one way to put together a master carver with those who wanted to learn to carve, for example. Put together, you know, a person who was very creative in terms of cornhusk work with young people that wanted to learn that. And we created an organization called the Seneca Nation Organization for the Visual Arts. The other person who did this with me was Carson Waterman, who was a Seneca artist. But right before I came here, I was an iron worker. A job ran out among things I had been doing, running the Indian Center in Buffalo, New York, and I had to get back up on the iron. I hadn't been back on the iron since I was a college student, when I used to work in the summers. So I kind of, I had enough of that, I can tell you. It was one of the toughest winters. We had the blizzard of 77, working outdoors, the whole 9 yards. But my boss wanted to teach me how to bid jobs. And he came to me and he said, I'll get you off the iron, I'll teach you how to bid jobs, and you can do this. At the same time, the community house was calling me and saying, we need a curator for the gallery. Would you come down? Before this, there was kind of a group in the community that were running the gallery. Michael Bush was very instrumental. Rosemary Richmond was very instrumental. And then there were a number of other members of the community. Iola Boyle comes to mind, Louis Mofsey. People like that were working with this gallery and trying to put together exhibits. But they were taking traveling exhibits. And my intent was to create new exhibits, not to bring in ones that were traveling, although I might need to do that. Mainly I wanted to create new exhibits with artists that I knew and artists I wanted to show. So I accepted the idea of coming to New York City. I moved down here and for a while stayed with a good friend named Joe Villagomez, who lived in Connecticut, and commuted for a while, and then ultimately got an apartment in Brooklyn, and then eventually 2nd Avenue and 11th Street. I lived there for a while. And so, there were a lot of people who helped. Jesse Coudet, Jolene Rickard. Jolene Rickard did all of our graphics for the gallery. Jesse did whatever. He was kind of the gopher for us. But another person who was extremely important to the gallery being able to be open was a guy named Bobby Anko. I don't know how many of you knew Bobby Anko. Bobby was Kiowa. Bobby was at Wounded Knee. Bobby was a veteran of Vietnam, but Bobby was an electrician. And he literally took apart a whole ceiling full of spaghetti, meaning cable everywhere, because it was light welding to put together frames. Took it apart, rewired the entire gallery, hit the switch, and all the lights came on. And I was just, can't tell you how grateful I was that he was around. And Will Guy found ways to repair our walls, which were sad and, very weak, and he figured out how to do it so that we had good wall space to hang paintings on. So it was a real community effort. It really was. And the community house also hired a few guys that came in and did some things too. But so much was done with volunteerism, really. That's how we renovated that gallery. But I realized the community house was moving to Broadway and 13th Street, up above the Village Voice, and there was no space for a gallery there. So I went to Soho and I found the second floor loft space that was in horrible shape, and we tore it apart and fixed it up so that it became a gallery space with a gift shop area and an office.
And so, in those first years before We the People is just sort of a marker, where did you get the artists that were in your shows? Like, what was your approach to organizing those exhibitions in those early years? Yeah, in the early years,
sometimes people would bring me a name of someone or an idea, but quite early on, I connected with Edgar Heapabirds. I showed Edgar first time in 1979 in an invitational Northeast show because he was attending Tyler in Philadelphia. And so I was able to include his work, and it was a word piece like this. And so then Edgar kind of began to get some ideas of exhibits, some kind of more real abstract painting. He wanted to really emphasize that. And Jean Quick-to-See Smith came along, and she was working with the Great Canyon Group. The Great Canyon Group included Larry Emerson, Jean, Emmy Whitehorse, Paul Willetto, Conrad House, and we were showing their work. Was Lorenzo Clayton part of that group also? No, he wasn't. Okay. He was not. And Lorenzo, by that time, I think was teaching at Cooper, if I remember right, Cooper Union. And so in addition to Edgar and Jean, eventually George Longfish. George Longfish was teaching out at UC Davis, and he began to curate exhibits. And so then if they put together a good exhibit and they wanted to send it east, then I was the space where we could put that up. And if I connected them with other artists, then we could show them in San Francisco because there was a space there for contemporary art. And so there was that kind of reciprocation going on, you know, even that early on. Another case, you know, like I mentioned South Dakota, I connected with a man who ran a gallery there and, you know, was able to show a number of artists from South Dakota. I went out and visited different artist studios. I had been out there a lot earlier working with the NEA to help fund some sort of small community spaces around the United States. I went to a lot of different little cities and worked with them. Anyway, but this time I went back and worked with a guy named Mark St. Pierre, Colleen Cutshall, Arthur Amiot, Robert Penn, and there were some others that were involved at that time and put their show together. I also have to mention that one of the very helpful other people was the Canadian Consulate General. The Canadian Consulate General supported 3 different exhibitions of Canadian artists. I did a major Inuit show working with the Inuit Gallery of Toronto, and then I did a pretty good sized show of contemporary First Nations artists, and that one, again, the Canadian Consulate supported that, and then one other one after that I was able to do. The name of that, the title of that particular one is escaping me at the moment. But so that's kind of how it worked, you know, and again, as I discovered artists or I, you know, heard of artists, I would always try also to reach out to Haudenosaunee artists and do a show, bring in some of their work. You know, I did tried to do one every couple of years of Haudenosaunee artists as well.
Mm-hmm. And so then Jean and Harmony approached you about...
Yeah, about this show, Sweetgrass Cedar and Sage, yeah. But Jean had done one on Native women photographers first, and that one was very well received too. And we really, you know, found photographers working all over the U.S., Native American, and we, you know, we mounted an exhibit of that. And then that kind of led to this Sweetgrass Cedar and Sage, but she really wanted to work with Harmony and Aaron Younger, who was, as I said, the director of Atlatl, and that they got the funding to be able to do the catalog. We had done so many shows that we'd never been able to produce catalogs. I had done one of Northwest Coast artists. I was able to produce a small catalog for that.
So here's that catalog.
Yeah, here's.
For Women of Sweetgrass Cedar.
Yeah, there's some great work in that catalog. Another good thing that existed at this particular time, there was something called Museums Collaborative. And Museums Collaborative, what they would do is, just as an example, they would give me the design department of the Museum of Modern Art, and they would design the flyer that I was going to use to announce the show. They're graphic designers. And then the Museums Collaborative would pay for the printing of that. I worked with the Brooklyn Museum, I worked with the Museum of Natural History, and I also worked, as I said, with MoMA, and I think there was one other one in there. So, you know, there were these kind of things. And the Northwest Coast show I put together, there was a Northwest Coast show that Alan Wardwell had put together. And it sort of, you know, I was showing the contemporary and Alan was showing the historic pieces. And that was a good collaboration.
So it sounds like there was a lot of support within the arts community in the city for what you were doing. It wasn't just you guys having to find bits and scraps the way it was for me when I was working at the community house.
Yeah.
2000, 2005, it was very difficult to get any support.
It was always a struggle. You know, NISCA, I always felt NISCA underfunded us. I mean, I think what we were doing was so unique and was so much bigger than just like serving people within New York State. We were serving people on a broader level. And they probably didn't really appreciate that as much as they should have. And, you know, I had quite a few arguments with people at NISCA over their level of funding for us. And sometimes they weren't too happy with me, but they also, I was a panelist for NISCA, so I had to do a lot of work with NISCA at various times. Yeah,
yeah. Well, let's move to the next image, which is, I believe, okay, all right. So now we're up to 1987, and by this point, had you moved on from the community house gallery?
Yeah, I left New York in 1985, and again, moved back home, so to speak, but I really moved back to run Ganondagan State Historic Site. And, you know, it was, again, my nation reaching out to me. They needed a person, they hoped it would be Seneca, who would be the first site manager for this particular historic site, which is commemorating a 17th century Seneca town. And so I went back home and you know, became the site manager for this 569 acres of land with hiking trails, and then we created a bark longhouse, and in 2015 we opened the Seneca Art and Culture Center, a brand new building, which really raised the whole thing a bit.
So even though you had left New York, then you still were invited to this show. People knew you. Was it Jimmy or was it Gene that invited you?
I think Jimmy actually first kind of reached out, and I was introduced to Gene at the Westbury show when we were out there.
Okay.
Yeah. Old Westbury, I think it was called.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Yeah. And Alan, you also were in the exhibition, but also not living in New York at the time. This is before you actually moved to New York.
That's right. I was living in Boston. I had been there for a while. And I had met Jimmy in Boston, actually, the show that had traveled to Massachusetts College of Art. And Jimmy invited me to be in the show. And 1987 was a big year for me because I went through a lot of firsts. This was the first time that I exhibited, quote, as a Native American artist. I was a painter at the time. You know, I was showing at Barbara Krakow Gallery in Boston. I thought of myself as someone who would stay a painter, but I was looking for a way to get sort of history and reality into my work. And I could see that there were possibilities in other directions. And so I started collaborating with artists. It was the first time that I collaborated with other artists on these. I sort of traded the studio for the street for a while. We were doing these ad hoc installations in Boston, this group led by artist Jerry Beck. And I also, so I did my first sort of sculptures and my first large-scale works and first installation. And actually, first shows in New York were in 1987. I actually showed in Creative Times Art on the Beach 8, which was on Hunters Point in Queens with that group of artists from Boston. So it was a big year for me, and this sort of really capped it. And it was actually the first, it was an opportunity for the first sort of solo installation I ever did, and it was a mess. I mean, it was like really the kitchen sink. But
it was described in one of the essays as a dark room.
Yeah, it was yeah, sort of mirrors my unconscious. But at the time, I was trying to actually get some history into it. I called the piece Up Biblum God, which was the translation of the name of the Bible in the Narragansett language. And I had grown up primarily in New England, so I had some of that sort of history that I wanted to get in. And I was also very interested in the fact that New York started out as a fur trading post. And of course, that's in terms of the Haudenosaunee stuff, that's big in our background. So I was trying to get all that in, and I didn't know how to do it. So if you go to the next slide.
Oh, I don't think it's there.
Well, actually,
we'll come to that.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
I have another question about this one before we move on.
Okay.
Right.
Can you go back? Go back one. So was this actually your first installation work?
Well, I had been part of this sort of collaborative work with the artists in Boston, and I had designed and painted and built like a 16-foot high open book on the site of an old bookstore that I had worked at actually in high school that had been torn down. You know, I had a fire and been torn down. So I started getting interested in site as a way of approaching something and starting off with site, starting off with a context or possible contexts. And that just created a whole different way. It sort of unleashed a whole, you know, a whole process that I evolved that involved research and involved trying to use material instead of just using paint. I felt confined by the sort of use of sort of traditional paint and sculpture. You know, I'd been trained by abstract painters to paint large abstract paintings, which I did for a while. But I was looking for something else, and I started evolving more into a sort of collage aesthetic. And this was it writ large. Yeah, yeah.
I'm kind of curious for both of you, because I also have, Peter had the works from the exhibition that you had.
Yes.
And we have better pictures, but these are the historical, images of from the actual exhibition. Did the curators talk to you about what they were looking for, or did they do studio visits, or how did they direct you or decide to choose these particular works for this exhibition?
There was no studio visit, I know that. At this point in time, one of my things was that I could transport an entire exhibit by putting bags inside of bags. So it would have one large shopping bag, and then the rest of the bags would be gradated down, and then I could transport the whole thing on a subway by just carrying one shopping bag, and I was kind of into that. Anyway, so these were just bags that I was doing at the time. I have to credit a man named Charlie Ahern, who was the first one who really encouraged me to keep doing these bags that I was doing. And the first time I showed them was in the Times Square show. And I don't know if anybody's in here old enough to remember the Times Square show. I'm sure there is. But at any rate, in a former massage parlor on 41st Street, actually. And but it was huge. I mean, it was 3 stories high, and there were, you can think Kenny Scharf, Jean-Michel, Keith Haring, Charlie and John, and I mean, you can go on and on. Christy Rupp, I mean, there were a whole bunch of people in that show. So anyway, from that I started showing, and then I showed it down here in a place called Just Above Midtown, a whole wall full of bags at that time, and that was a great venue, that particular show. But no, I just kind of picked out what I wanted to show, and I came here, and I was kind of full of myself, I guess, because everybody else was working away installing the show, and I said, I'm going uptown to see shows. And I left. And it got installed this way because I wasn't a part of it. That was me.
It was pretty laissez-faire, as I remember it.
Yeah. So, Alan, did you say you wanted to do an installation, and they just gave you the space?
And they were foolish enough to give me a room.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Let's do the next image. Okay, so I have some historical images here that I got from the artist. So, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Well, the black and white is from the one-man show I did in Lloyd's Gallery at American Art. And this would have been about 1972. I was doing these sort of large canvases that were full of texture and very bright color. And you'll kind of see a piece coming up that's more like that. But so this was a print that I produced. It was a lithograph. They took the lithograph and then used the image for the poster. And this is 2nd Avenue and 11th Street, an apartment that Jolene Rickard and I shared. And this is, me sitting in the front room painting. St. Mark's Church is right out there, right out the window. And it was nice because there were always trees there as you looked out the window. And this painting went to a friend of mine by the name of Sally Benedict. And in exchange, I got the most beautiful jewelry from a man named Julius Cook, a Mohawk silversmith. And this is a ring that came from that exchange. This is some of my early work. This one here on the left I call Hollyhock. And it really dates, I'm going to say this one is about 1974, roughly. And the one on the far right is a recreation of the one that was in the Art in America article in 1972, and the title is Orenda. And Orenda, the original one, burned up in a fire on my grandmother's property when an arson burned down a building that had a lot of my artwork. So all of my artwork from the early 70s burned up in that fire. And so I just got this idea in my head last summer that I was going to recreate this piece, not having any idea that they were going to revisit the 72 article, not having any idea that this show was going to happen that we have upstairs. I just started working on this painting because the festival that we usually sponsor at the third weekend in July had to end early because the weather was so terrible. It was raining cats and dogs. Anyway, so Monday I had some energy and I went to the art supply store and picked up some things and started working on this painting. And anyway, so that's where they're from.
And this is a little bit later.
Yeah, this is later, 87, 90. This painting has been everywhere. I mean, it started at the Heard Museum in Phoenix, and then it went out ultimately around the U.S. It went to New Zealand, and then it went across Canada to different venues. And so it really, there's a lot of mileage on this one. And it's a great piece. Hint, hint.
It's available.
It's available, yes. Okay, so this is this piece here is upstairs, Liberty for Sale. I came here, you know, and the former director of the Studio Museum in Harlem, she and I were invited to a panel discussion, and there was this discussion going on which really kind of blew my mind. And what it boiled down to was that if any museum was ever in some sort of danger and it was losing its funding and it was really having a difficult time, virtually anything in its collection was available for sale. And this was sort of agreed upon by the whole group that was there, people who were, you know, writers and people working in museums and so forth. And I just thought, wow, that's amazing. And then I wondered, what would you sell the Statue of Liberty to? But the other thing about the Statue of Liberty is her back is to us. To the indigenous people, her back is to us. She's welcoming all the people from Europe, right? Welcoming the immigrants. And today, we're having this big argument about immigrants, you know, and who should be allowed into this country and who should not be allowed into this country. But the World Trade Center was still standing. So those two silvery type figure rectangles below the handles, those are the World Trade Center. And you know, the same artist who made this ring supervised the gangs that welded both towers of the World Trade Center, Julius Cook, and finished ahead of schedule. And I've been around so long that I remember when those two buildings were completely covered with canvas from ground to the top as people worked on the inside, you know, doing the steel work and doing the rest of the stuff. And it was fantastic because you would come down the West Side Highway and here were these canvases like, you know, really moving in the wind. And at one point in time, we did a show of Mohawk artists, and we did it in the governor's offices. So that was the first time I ever got up into the World Trade Center and got this magnificent view of the harbor. It was just unbelievable. And as we know the rest of it.
All right, so Alan, we've got some images of your work from this period as well, and a better detail, I guess, of that installation here.
Yeah.
It's in color.
not as scary, I think. Yeah, maybe it is. Yeah. So on the left is a painting I did in 1987 when I was still working in my studio in Boston. I had made a move away from canvas, at least, to different sort of substrates, things that I'd found in the street. So this was like the stool top that I found on the street, which I collaged birch bark onto, shellacked it, and painted this image. But you know, I was trying to sort of work out of this romantic, you know, landscape sort of, I don't know, thing that I was in for a while. And I, again, was trying to find a way to bring time into the work in a different way and history. So my first attempt was Up Biblum God. If we go on to the next slide, so there was so much in that room, but I actually started writing. I had covered the walls with black set paper, and just started writing little historical texts. And so I think that was said about this show, about the Unholding show, that there's a sort of textual element that runs through the show here and there. It certainly did in my work, being able to just somehow write and somehow merge information with other sorts of information was a big change for me, and something that that kept showing up. So if we can go on to the next one. Yeah, so I actually left Boston. 87 was also another first for me. There was a sort of second chapter to We the People. It was the revision show at Walter Phillips Gallery in Banff. Helga Pakasar was the curator of that show, and she had come through and seen We the People and picked a few artists from that show to be in, including Edgar Heap of Birds, and Edward Patra was in that show, and it was an interesting experience to go to Banff and all that stuff. And I ended up spending a year in Banff, and then I came back to New York to do a project with the Public Art Fund, which is this piece, Earth's Eye, in 1989, sort of 90, it was up. And what I wanted to do is commemorate, I started again looking at sites, and they were also very laissez-faire about, you know, where do you want to work? And I was always interested in this site that's the site of a former pond, a large deep pond that was a freshwater pond in Lower Manhattan it's completely gone, except the springs that fed it are being used to cool the air conditioning system in the criminal courts building or something like that. So I just wanted to do something that was a sort of monument to this pond. And the original idea, there's a little pocket pond there. You know, the area, what happened is that it attracted industry and things like tanneries, and it just was a mess and a public health hazard by the late 1700s. So they basically just, and there was a giant shell midden, you know, from time immemorial, and it was a significant site, both for the original Lenape people and later for the colonists, but again, sort of an early example of environmental destruction, and also this sort of cover-up where they bulldozed the shell midden into the pond and just filled in all the wetlands. Canal Street was a sort of canal. It was an outlet to the Hudson out of this pond. And so I just wanted to, so I ended up doing this thing. I was going to try to flood this little pocket pond, actually bring up the actual water that was from the pond. But at the time, there were 40 people living under the eaves of the civil court building. And so the city was afraid that it would be like this health hazard again. So I just switched into this sort of language of monument and did castings. There's 40 individual pieces, but I did castings of things that related to the history of the pond. That's one of the.
Do you feel like this is the piece where you really shifted from the more representational work that you were kind of hanging on to in '87 to the more conceptual work?
Yes, it was a different way of being representational. It was actually letting the things sort of be them. You know, it was taking traces rather than some sort of expressionistic representation. I thought it was evidentiary in a certain way, and I was trying to, you know, also to sort of layer the work in a way and have it have a nod to not only this, you know, this cast concrete, you know, so material became something for me that was also symbolic. It wasn't just like with paints, it's like it's a given, you're going to paint with paints on some sort of substrate, but I started getting interested in just material for their own symbolic value and their own sort of, you know, aesthetic value as well. And so this was like about the street. And none of these were nailed down, they weren't, you know, cemented down, so anybody could have taken these or sprayed them or destroyed them, but it was up for about a year and nobody did anything.
How did you get all the pigeons?
Yeah, well, that was the hardest thing about this. No. No, they would collect there, especially when it was raining, and it was really weird. Like, they would just sort of be like they were ducks in a pond, you know? Yeah.
Is there imagery on those panels?
Sorry.
Yeah, there's casts.
Yeah,
so
you can see the corn up here.
Yeah, so what I did was, I had a residency out in Sailor's Snug Harbor, which is a cultural center now, but it's this beautiful Greek revival complex, an old sailor's home on Staten Island. And I lived there for a year. My first year in New York, I was living there. And there was a pond there. And I started just wandering and hanging out at the pond and looking at the, you know, the blue heron that was there, and, you know, and also the broken bottles and the, you know, trash. And so I just started taking little, sort of almost like soil samples, little, you know, little casts of the banks, the muddy banks of this pond. And that grew into this piece, you know. So I was sort of transporting a live pond from a sort of a dead sailor's home to a dead pond that's, you know, surrounded by all these court buildings, like family court, you know, criminal court building. You know, when they first filled this in, it wasn't long before they built this monstrous prison that was the original tombs, where there were executions. So imagine the life of this thing, this beautiful pond that ends up this execution grounds in like 40 years, you know? How long it had been there. But, so I was interested in that kind of bringing forward those sorts of stories and somehow having people wander into that. There was one of these markers. You see the one that's to the sort of off by itself on the upper right. So that had a map where it showed where the original pond was superimposed on the city streets. So you could have a sense. And that's sort of how I look at a lot of, I don't know, urban America or even just general America. I sort of regress it, you know. I just imagine it looking, a lot of it's ugly. And I just try to make it look better, you know. So anyways.
What about, okay.
Yeah, so, yeah, so I met Jimmy and Maria Teresa and Gene Fisher actually before this show, and Jimmy invited me to collaborate with them on a performance and an installation piece in this Biennale in London and Madrid called Edge '92. So the reason I brought this up is this is the year '92, which was a big year. Yeah, because of the Columbus quincentennial, right? I remember James Luna like rejecting that and saying, you know, talk to me in '93. He didn't want there to be this sudden, you know, sort of attention and then you never see anybody again. But anyways, it was interesting to, it was the first time that I ever showed in Europe, and it was interesting to collaborate with them on a piece and a performance piece. I've only done a couple performances in my life, and that was one of them. And we had also installation stuff, but that was the gear that actually Jimmy had. It looked a lot like Jolene's piece, didn't it? Yeah, yeah. But I guess, you know, there was an idea about silence and about being silenced, and we did things that were, you know, sort of, we sat in the street and people gathered around, we did weird things. And then on the right is a sign, a street sign that was created for a big project by Repo History, which I had, Lucy Lepard had seen my Earth's Eye piece and invited me to join this artist collective, a very multicultural, very interesting group that I did join, and we did, as the first big project that I participated in was this thing called the Lower Manhattan Sign Project, and some of my fellow Repo historians are actually here, and it's great to see them. And anyway, so I was interested in the site that was the site of John Jacob Astor, who made his first fortune being a fur trader with our people. And I just, you know, I had painted on a Hudson's Bay blanket. That was another thing in my artist space show, in this show here. And so I just took that format, and that's a peace medal. You know, it says peace and friendship. Some reason Indian people used to like these, and it had Astor's mug on it. And so I just, you know, thought it almost like learning from Edgar, you know, this sort of concentrated sort of political poetry in a way of confronting this history in some sort of concentrated textual form.
I just wanted to make a couple of comments. Tom Huff, a Cayuga artist, did an earth piece in the gallery on West Broadway. But the problem was we had to find dirt in Manhattan, right? Real honest dirt. And the only place we could find it was a garden that was maintained by a guy called Adam Purple. I don't know if anybody remembers Adam Purple. He used to go around Manhattan stepping into purple paint and then tracking himself around town, and so you could follow where Adam Purple had been by the tracks, right? But we went over there, and he had, you know, he was doing organic farming, right, in the most bombed out area of the Lower East Side. And he's, oh yeah, go ahead, you know. So we loaded up all this dirt, transported it to West Broadway, and put it in there, and then Tom created this piece. The other thing I wanted to comment on was the first time I really paid attention to the white beavers in Astor Place subway. I then connected to John Jacob Astor, and I figured out, oh, fur trade. This is so that spawned a whole series of pieces by me that were all about the fur trade too, and using that.
Love to see those.
Yeah.
Yeah. Should we go to the next one?
Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I was also interested in, you know, having done a couple of sort of public art sort of works, is doing stuff that was more public and more or less on the street. So this, I got invited to do the Washington Square windows. The Gray Art Gallery used to have these two big windows that they would let artists do stuff. And I was actually living in a building just down on Washington Place for a year. A friend of mine took a sabbatical from NYU, so I actually was going to the park all the time, and I was reading up on it, and you know, it's a necropolis. There's something like maybe as many as 20,000 burials underneath Washington Square, and it was a potter's field, and when they were digging the arch for the Washington Square Arch, the permanent one, it was originally it was a plaster thing originally. It was for the 100th anniversary of George Washington's inauguration. But when they were digging the foundation for the permanent one, the one that's there now, they turned over some graves. And the people were buried in these yellow shrouds, which was indicating the yellow fever epidemic of the time, which used to wipe out like 10% of East Coast cities during that. It was like the first public health crisis on the scale of like the AIDS epidemic in its day. And so I just did this sort of, you know, mass shroud sort of piece. But it was up for a long time, and you could just sort of see it through the park, especially in the wintertime. It would just have this sort of weird yellow glow. So I think that's where I sort of, I just thought I'd transition a little into the 90s. I think there's one more slide. Yeah, so a lot of this stuff is really about the land, you know, and there's different ways of approaching the land. And of course there's maps, and there's a sort of coloniality built into maps. And so I took this school map that I found of New York State, you know, those that you'd pull down, you know, those old, I don't know if anyone's old enough for those, but anyways, a New York State one, and I just painted out all the names that weren't Indian names. And it's a pretty complete map, actually, you know? Yeah. Yeah, so I called it No York. Yeah. And then the piece on the right is, you know, so I spent a lot of time, my people are from 6 nations, and it's a long story, but I didn't grow up in that environment, in that culture. And so I was spending a lot of time with my sister there in the late 90s, and actually learning about culture. And I was very interested in these corn husk figures. And I just started making them, and I just started making a bunch of them, and put them together in this installation. I usually don't use human figures in my work at all, but it seemed like it was both. It's not really. It's sort of a group portrait in a way. It's sort of a big human figural work, but also not. It's also these beautiful objects. So, yeah. So that was a piece that I did for my residency at Art in General in 1999. Mm-hmm. So that's where I leave off.
Well, I have a quote to read to you that was from the original catalog. It's Paul Chott-Smith in his essay commenting on the exhibition We the People. And he said, "This is an excellent year for an alternative art exhibit on Indians." And I thought that was a really interesting comment, because to me, from my perspective, and I wasn't in New York in the 1980s, I was still in high school, and not here. But to me, the work that was generated from these shows and in these exhibitions, to me that was always what contemporary Native art was. It wasn't an alternative. But in reading a lot of writing from the time, looking at that 1972 Art in America issue, for example, listening to you talk about your time here in the city, in some ways it sounds like, wow, what a fascinating time to be here in the city. Adam Purple, I mean, all these like characters, and this sort of almost, it seemed like it was a much smaller community and there was much more interaction between the people, just because, I think maybe because of volume and the way communication was. But at the same time, it seems like We the People was really looking for artists who are pushing back very hard at that sentimental, romantic, representational image of Native people, and that reaction and that work that was very reactive to that was very conscious and very strong, and was really reflected in that work. So I guess my question for you two right now is that now it's 30 years later.
Yes.
And how do you feel like the Indian art world has changed or hasn't changed, and also the perception of Native art in the mainstream?
I'll start. And I experienced different things, both good and bad to me. When we were really getting the Community House Gallery up and really getting it visible, especially in Soho, the idea was inclusiveness. It was to find our artists wherever they were and bring them to New York, or bring their work to New York at least, and show their work, and to expose their work to really mostly a non-native audience, although the openings that we had, all the Indian people in town flocked to those openings. They were huge and they were great. And then I went through the time period when we started throwing one another out of the canoe. You're not Indian enough, you're not blood quantum enough, you're not whatever, finding reasons to throw each other out of the canoe. And it was really disturbing to me, because it was so counterproductive in a way to what we had tried to accomplish, which I grant you was not perfect. And then, not only were we throwing people out of the canoe that, our own people, but then we started taking our friends and throwing them out of the canoe too. And our friends didn't know how to respond. In other words, what I mean is friendly writers suddenly felt as though they were alienated and unwelcome. And this was kind of coming from places other than New York at that particular time. But I was in the middle of it because, in fact, at that particular time, I believe, I was the president of the board for Atlatl. And so I would have to deal with this, kind of countrywide, when we got together, conversation that took place.
So I'll just say that Atlatl was a Native art service organization for Native artists, primarily U.S.
U.S. primarily,
right.
Yes. And, I served as the president of that, and I was the president of the board for the Institute of American Indian Arts at one particular time, too. So through that, there was this kind of refereeing, if you will, trying to figure out how to keep us all moving together in some way.
And that was in the 80s, or was that in the 90s?
This is getting more into the 90s, really. Yeah, it's getting into the 90s. And, and then the other thing that was happening, I keep talking about it, is multiculturalism. Multiculturalism was a stew, right? And so all the things were in the stew, but then you couldn't see anything in the stew because everything was in the stew, and then there was nothing in the stew either. And it was just, so tough to me, I really thought that it didn't happen for us. We were still Native artists. We were still on the outside looking in. We really didn't get those opportunities that I think, we needed. And certainly our work wasn't being collected by the museums that I thought should have been paying attention. And one of our good friends, of course, was Lucy. And this is where it gets crazy, because believe it or not, our politics is different than the left politics. The left's politics, the liberal, the whatever you want to call it, you know, I don't know how to characterize it without insulting people. Okay, you know, it's not our politics. Our politics is sovereignty. Our politics is land. It's based on our land, our possession of land, our original being. You know, we weren't given the land. We hold the land as an allodium because we were here on the land. No one gave it to us. And so holding on to our land base and all that's involved in having our governments from our nations, whether they're the chiefs or whether they're the elective bodies, hold on to that land and maintain control for the benefit of our people, for the benefit of the future generations coming, you know, is a central theme in our politics, if you will. And then we get into the rest of it, which is gaming or cigarettes or gasoline or whatever. And actually, that's what Buffalo Road is all about. Buffalo Road 3 is all about that time period between the time when our people allowed gaming to come into our territories and we fought it. And those who fought it and those who wanted it and the warriors who came around and you know, the very touchy situations that we faced within what I'm talking about in New York State, within our communities. So, so I don't know where I'm going here, but at any rate, you know, so I went through all of that stuff, right? And wound up having to really work with our governments. And that's, once I went home, again, you know, from 85 on, it was like I was in the right place at the right time, and they started handing me responsibilities, and I just had to take them and run with them, whatever they were, to help, you know, and to learn from great teachers, John Mohawk, Orrin Lyons, you know, these guys, brainy bunch, really. John was a genius. I'll leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Alan, looking at the art world then as you experienced it and how things have changed or not changed?
Well, I think that some people navigate the art world better than others. and I think that Jimmy Durham did a pretty good job. And I think that then it created a sort of token situation. You know, we don't have huge numbers. We're somewhat invisible, even in the city that we supposedly are the highest, the biggest concentration in terms of population of any American city of American Indian people are here in New York. But you know, we don't all look like Plains Indians, you know, which is in everybody's head. And so we're sort of doubly invisible, you know, and so I think that for a long time the art world was content to just have sort of Jimmy, you know, however, perhaps wrongly, carrying that place, you know, and then there are a few others sort of let in here and there, but it was definitely a sort of token situation. I mean, a lot of our work and the work of my peers is really quite, you know, quite strong work, as strong as a lot of the stuff that you see that's celebrated, and it's got a relationship to, let's say, there's a landscape show or a show about sort of like political geography. There's a lot of non-Indian artists who are in those shows over and over again, and we don't get invited, even though our stuff has been, we've been doing this stuff well for over 30 years. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's pretty hard. People don't give up their power or their slots very easily. And the art world is really one of the most sort of, you know, backwards. I mean, it's not 2018 in the art world, is it? You know? No. It's like, you know, it's 1818. You know?
And oddly enough, once again, this show upstairs has gotten tremendous press coverage. Mm-hmm. And I credit Jay and I credit Jamie and, you know, Harry, the work you guys have done. I want to acknowledge what you've done to draw attention to this show to those who are going to read about it, maybe not get here to see it. And so I feel we're kind of at a certain point in time of change. I really do feel it. And I feel that we just have to push it a little bit further to make that change happen. David's book, you know, we have to push it. Amerindon's, the work you guys have done. We have to push it just a little bit harder. And not everyone is going to benefit completely from it. But we do need to you know, and I only want to use this word, but the art world has to give it up. You know what I mean? They've got to open the door, and otherwise I'm going to kick it in.
Well, we tried doing some kicking in this last couple of years with Indigenous New York. Yeah.
That's great. So we have a really interesting audience. I think we want to have a few minutes for any questions from the audience before we get too much further. Sure. Raise your hand. Any questions?
Thank you, Alan and Peter and Kathleen, for your wonderful history of the 80s and your own particular work in that. And my question is for Alan and Peter, and it's about what Kathleen gestured towards at the beginning of the presentation, which was the action by Edgar Heap of Birds, who was here last week, and I wish I had asked him this question then, but I'll ask you instead to respond to it. But about his action, which was to pull out of We the People in '87 as his own response to the disinterest of Jimmy Durham and Gene Fisher in his land politics of the time, which was his response to the centenary celebration of the Oklahoma Land Rush, one of the largest removals of Indian territory in American history. And he wanted to deal with that and bring it up, and it was one of the largest protests of the moment. And Gene Fisher and Jimmy Durham thought it was too rural, too, far away from the metropole to do what they wanted to accomplish with the show. And that speaks to a very different politics that today is, it would be almost inconceivable to think of a curator rejecting a land politic or a local protest, something like Standing Rock, in favor of the city. I was wondering if you could speak to your own practices at the time and today in terms of that urban versus land or local practice, and how you saw it come out in the show.
Well, I'm not sure that that's completely accurate, because the way I heard it was that Edgar just wanted his guys to be the whole show, And so there were Jimmy and Gene wanted to show a sort of cross-section or more people. And Edgar wanted the whole gig, is what I heard.
And I would think that is pretty close. Well, I mean, I knew Edgar. I know Edgar. I know him really well. Yes. I was the very first person to show Edgar's work in New York. I was the first person to tell Edgar, you need to go home. Leave Tyler, go home to Oklahoma, and immerse yourself in your Comanche and your tradition. And I mean, it wasn't like he hadn't thought of it, and it wasn't that he hadn't incorporated some of it, but I wanted him to do what I had done, which is go home and take that immersion and really then understand who you are, understand who you are fundamentally, and use that as the basis for your thinking, okay? And so, I mean, and at that point then he became a little bit of I don't know, just a very strict idea of what should be. And I mean, if you even take the cover of Art in America that he created, this last one, don't dance for pay, okay? I dance with dance groups all the time, and we get paid a penance, but it isn't that. It's not that. It's maintaining something that we get off on. I mean, we love dancing, and it doesn't matter when or where we want to do it.
Isn't that work itself a dance for pay?
Yeah.
Well, what I heard. Now, I've read about this conflict, and it's interesting to me because Edgar was involved in so many different things that were happening. He was definitely one of those artist drivers who was really pushing for things. But I did read it in some ways both ways, that it was his particular work that was so Oklahoma specific, and also that he wanted to do a whole show that was all Oklahoma artists. So interesting sort of story behind the story there that I wasn't aware of until reading a lot about this show and its history.
Edgar had done real good at navigating, as he said, the art world. I mean, he'd already done Creative Time. He'd done Times Square with that big, huge, light billboard, you know, and then he did a few more after that, and got to know Material Culture, I think it was, or yeah, and different ones, you know, that really. So he found his way to maneuver through those and break down some of those barriers, and I applaud him for it.
So do we have another question out there? No one?
We've answered all the questions.
No, we covered it all. Oh, well, okay.
Just a question to sort of further the conversation about the community house when it was founded. I'd love to know what it was like in terms of other sort of collaboration or solidarity with other identity-specific cultural organizations that were founded at the same time, whether it be Museo del Barrio in New York City, or even across the country with a place like Galeria de la Raza, which was the first place that, you know, was founded by Chicano artists. I just wonder, Peter, if you can speak a little bit to sort of work that was done cross-culturally with similar groups.
And we definitely did. Marta Vega was a great organizer, and Marta Vega put together, you know, a coalition of different organizations from LA, from New York, from Houston, San Antonio, you know. So, you know, the Caribbean Cultural Center, Marta Vega runs that. But she really did this networking that brought in Native artists and brought in Chicano, you know, artists and others, you know, I mean, with performance and so forth. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name of the organization that we worked with, but that was the networking that we did. And I think at its best, it was real good, you know, but as I said, that multiculturalism kind of hurt us all in a certain way. And that's a shame, but I feel that way about it, you know. At the same time, you know, to have a person like Marta there, I mean, she's heavy duty.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really changed from this period we've been discussing till today is that there really has been a demise of these native artist-run galleries. You know, the American Indian Community House Gallery isn't the same as it used to be. There's not a
defunct.
Yeah.
Is the word you're searching for?
American Indian Contemporary Arts in San Francisco. They closed, I think, in like 96 or 97.
Right.
Two Rivers Gallery, another gallery in Minneapolis are making a go at it. But for me as a curator, the American Indian Community House was a wonderful place to kind of get my feet wet as a curator without the sort of high pressure you would have in a museum or larger gallery. And today, when I'm talking to younger people who want to be curators, who are in school, I don't have some place where I can send them to do their first shows, because, you know, these places that are a little bit more informal, and yes, they were underfunded for sure, and that was always a struggle. But the flip side of that was that we had a lot of freedom.
We did. And so, you know, we were fortunate that because the community house devoted itself heavily to social services and to job employment and training and those kinds of things, a certain, you know, sizable amount of money came to the community house, which allowed us really to do the cultural component, to do the art part, to be able to lease a space in Soho. And so again, I really have to credit Mike Bush and Rosemary Richmond and members of that board who understood the reality and the necessity of doing it, and supported the performing artists as well, really, in that space. So, you know, we were fortunate at that time, and it's still, you know, I contrast it with Canada, where Native people, where First Nations people are so much better supported. I believe, personally at least, and of course I'm not Native Canadian, so I can't speak to it as well. But I just see what's happened, and you know, when you have like this incredible program at Banff that takes place, and you know, and we don't have something really comparable as far as I can tell.
Not at all.
That could be a whole other panel about the difference between how artists supported here and in Canada. I did want to do a shout out to Amarinda, because they have been supporting exhibitions of contemporary Native art in the city. Working with the Ken Kalaba Gallery. It's not quite, you know, the same as having a dedicated space, but I do appreciate their carrying the torch to have a space for that. There was one more question. Maybe we'll take just the one more question if You still have it.
Thank you all three very much. This was really a wonderful conversation. I have a follow-up question to what Peter said about misunderstandings and misreadings of your position as a progressive or liberal position, and then you were beginning to refer to critics who, might judge the work wrongly. So I would love to hear more about misunderstandings and misconceptions that you encounter today in your efforts and in your interactions and negotiations with non-Indigenous institutions or professionals.
How to answer that? Well, our educational system, I always have to lay this first at the doorstep of our education system. Our education system so undereducates non-Native people about us that they barely have any idea of who we are. And these are our neighbors. I'm talking about our neighbors don't know us. Don't even realize in some cases there's a reservation, there's a territory right next to where they live. They're wholly ignorant of the facts. And again, it's our educational system. And in New York State, just bear with me, I don't have any other way of doing an answer without talking about history a bit. So in New York State, if you take Western New York to the Hudson River, fourth graders are required to study a unit on the Haudenosaunee. From the Hudson River, basically Albany down, they're going to be focused on the Shinnecock, the Puspatuck, the Lenni Lenape. They're going to focus on others, Delaware, and that's great, okay? But that is it. That is it, fourth grade, okay? Then there's going to be this little bit of a touch in seventh grade. Again, that's it. So how would you know anything about us, right? Because what your information source comes from the media, comes from newspapers, who seize upon the conflicts and tell the story of the conflict as they understand it, okay? And some writers really are diligent about trying to really understand the source of the conflict. But we are in a constant state of having to defend our territories. And I know that maybe sounds crazy, but I'm not lying. This is a state which is not necessarily friendly to Haudenosaunee people, and definitely not friendly to my nation, okay, at the moment, right at the moment, literally. So okay, so if you don't know that, then you might not know where we're coming from in the work that we produce as to what it really reflects and what it's referring to. And it doesn't have to even be that overt. The act of doing art, when you are us, is an act of politics. It really becomes that. Anything we maintain, anything we feel is essential to be maintained, we do it in spite of all of the obstacles that are presented to almost prevent us from doing that. But, that's never going to deter us. That is never going to deter us. The fact that people don't get it and don't see why, it's not important. What's important is that we understand its necessity and that we do it. So therefore, that's the sort of context I come from when I say that there can be misunderstandings because, again, they don't know where we're coming from. Does that make sense? Okay.
Well, I want to thank you. I want to end on a little bit of a high note, and that is that even though we don't have the community house, we do still have the Native art community here in the city. And so many of you are here tonight, part of that community. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank my the two artists I have here with me, Pete and Alan, for their time and sharing these stories and reflecting back on this important exhibition and looking to the future.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank all of you.